where this whole thing is coming from and why things are like that. So didn't find that too uninteresting. So the background is, so I hope you have the slides open and you see them here. So the background is that the CC license people, so Creative Commons, say you shouldn't use Creative Commons licenses for software because there are these free software licenses and they have these funky names. So GNU, General Public License version 3, which is quite a long name. So I wonder what is actually behind that and what is it about. And this is just the tutorial that I have for this part. It's quite long, it's quite extensive, so it's written by Michael Kuhn, I think, and it's like, I don't know, 200, 300 pages just on software licenses. And they are fairly sensitive to this copyright issue, so they put actually on that that they, for using this tutorial, they grant the freedom to copy, modify, convey, adapt, and redistribute this work, except for the appendices under the terms of the CC Attribution Share Alike 4.0 license. So they put their tutorial under CC licenses, and then there are some more details on how they actually license this guide. I just found it interesting now that I understood, because these are typically these things, of course, that also when you sign your forms, these are these kind of terms and conditions that you never read, and but if you try to read them, you also don't understand them, so there's no point in reading. But I find when I now read this, I could understand certain aspects of it. So I understood that they actually put it under CC license, which made sense because I learned that it's of course like a manuals or literary work. And it's also interesting that they use the term convey in terms of distribute, which we might come back later. So there is quite a lot of literature on all these licenses. So this is also why I think if one uses them in a non-informed manner, or why it seems that, or at least for me, it seems like there is some things behind these things, because there are these different versions, there are these abbreviations and so on. And the thing is, there is a little bit of stuff behind these. So what is then the thing with the GNU General Public License version 3? So this rests actually on this work that happened in the 80s in the so-called free software movement, which goes back to the work of a single man, actually Michael Stallman, who will feature on the next slide. So the first thing is, what do they mean by free software? And the important thing here is free as in freedom. So a particular user has software freedom with respect to a particular program if that user has the following freedoms: the freedom to run the program for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and modify it, the freedom to redistribute copies, and the freedom to distribute copies of modified versions to others. And actually from reading this, it's all fairly intuitive. And I think from a reproducible, transparent, and open science data analytical viewpoint, I think, at least to me, these are actually the freedoms that we want to have the users of our software to have, right? So if you, as we discussed before the break, if you write some analysis pipeline for your research data set and you want to redistribute this with, now it's getting really, it is on.
It is on.
It is on. If you're redistributing your code with your research work, this is, I think, what you want, because otherwise it wouldn't make much sense, right? So why do you share your code? Of course, you want others to be able to study it. I don't think you have any problem with others to modify it and so on. So you actually, I think, want, for your analysis code, free, you want software freedom. One thing that is also interesting in this remark, in this context, is that everybody, I think, knows the term open source and open source community, but this is all. Yeah.
Do you have 5 minutes for me?
Yeah. Why not?
Very,
if
very
it's
brief. Only 1 minute.
Yeah.
Okay, just announcing that the workshop closes approximately at 4.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so approximately you can do 5 minutes. And then you have approximately an hour to think about your project, to relax, to enjoy the sunshine, and perhaps think about a bit about what you want to do. And then you return here, and at approximately 5:30 we can go into the atrium, which is the large room over there, and we'll just convene there. Okay? Sure. You're invited as well.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Yeah. See you tomorrow then. So that the free software people, they actually wouldn't call things open source, because open source is somehow associated with having access to the source code, but that is necessary but not sufficient for software freedom. So they actually, so this is also why I'm not referring to the open source movement, but the free software movement, because they make this fairly explicit in their writings. Just as a because in the Wikimedia world, people always, and also in my world until last week, people always talk about open source, but not free software. And what is now the idea behind this and where this is coming from? So the basic question is, why, if we are talking about free software and all these rights to software to do anything, why not just put things into the public domain? Of course, okay, I mean, you won't have this by attribution, which is might be interesting from the scientific perspective, but if you're not even in a scientific kind of community, but it's just a software community, you could just put things into the public domain. So why again talk about licenses? And this is really kind of a defining feature of this free software movement, so where they are coming from and their joint myth maybe. So the idea is that if you just put free software that you want to be free software, if you put it into the public domain, you have the problem that things are copyrightable in the public domain. And then they have this idea of a negative embrace, extend, and proprietize feedback loop. So this originates from, as I said, people at MIT and Harvard and software engineers around Michael Storman and the GNU project that we'll come into in a second. That there's quite a nice history piece by Michael Storman also, that kind of had in the early 80s the feeling that software, as soon as people figured that they could make money off that, software that used to be free specifically for the user to adapt, was put under non-disclosure agreements, and copyright was actually executed maybe on software. And the idea is that if you now put things just into the public domain, the following could happen. First, you feed software into the public domain, and then some entities might modify a little bit of the software and proprietarize it, and then the public domain, essentially, so people dedicating their software to the public domain, feed this proprietary software, because copyright of modifications of these works still applies. And then in the end, the incentive for free software release is actually lost, and you kind of first feed into the public domain, but then nobody knows why we're actually doing that, and everybody else is making the money, so let's not do that anymore. And then this free software thing is bleeding out. So that's their assumption. I mean, I think if one starts thinking about this circle, one can also, it's more an empirical question whether this actually would happen, or whether this has happened in certain circles, not maybe only with respect to software previously, but of course that was the motivation to then kind of break this circle with, I don't know why it's never really transitioning, breaking the circle with the copyleft principle. And this is actually the same thing as the share alike in the Creative Commons thing, but it's also a term that comes up, for example, in SPM, because SPM is also shared under this copyleft principle using the GPL license. The idea is very similar to the Creative Commons licenses, of course, because they came after this, is to hack copyright law. So use copyright law with a different aim, so not protecting only the creator, but here use copyright law to also foster and encourage free software. And the idea is fairly simple. So that's the same thing, is if you write software not dedicated to the public domain, but copyrighted, so essentially like I said, in Europe and also in the US, you don't have to do anything. It just gets your copyright, but you might want to even put in this little copyright symbol and make very explicit that this software that is created is falls under copyright. And then license this work under free software terms. So that's what they call copyleft principle. So to use copyright law to enforce free software terms. And we've seen that already in the Creative Commons. It's called share alike. So if you adapt something, so you have something that is for which it is allowed that you adapt it, something that is shared free under copyleft. You again need to, if you adapt it and share it, are only allowed to share it under a free content license. That's copyleft, and the idea is here so to avoid this bleeding out of the public domain and grant and uphold software freedom, essentially by forbidding others to forbid software freedom along the distribution and modification chains. So that's the general idea of copyleft. So then, of course, you can uphold this copyleft principle with different licenses, and one of them is this GPL license, which applies to free software. But of course, this share alike statement in the CC licenses, that's also a copyleft license in spirit. So where does this come from, and why are there these strange terms? So this comes from the GNU project, and this is Michael Stallman, who started that project in the early 80s. So the background is there. He wanted, so being frustrated with seeing more and more of the software being copyrighted and falling under non-disclosure rights, mainly from the perspective, that's also maybe interesting, from the perspective of the user who cannot adapt software. So he writes about that there was some kind of printer software that was a little bit annoying for him, and he wanted, just because he knew how to do it, of course, he wanted to adapt it to make printing easier, but then he figured that this was under copyright terms, and he could not change the software anymore. Like, you cannot change most of the software that you have commercially available because you don't have access to the source code, and this were then, or there are other means that protect the company's code from you changing it. It was not the motivation so much against making money. So he actually dropped out of MIT and working in this research environment and tried to make a living from free software. So it's always free as in freedom for the user, not in the sense that necessarily free software that can be adapted and can be modified and so on, that this is completely against commercial exploitation. So that's not the case. So he started this GNU project, and why GNU and why GNU? So these things always make me crazy if I don't know why certain things are called a certain way. And so then you get into these kind of things where GNU is the abbreviation for GNUs, not Unix, because Unix was around as a operating system at that time, but also under proprietary licenses. So they actually call it GNUs, not Unix, and then you start to get crazy because this abbreviation is somewhere wrong. Yeah. And then the reason for that is because they're programmers and they're funny and they know what recursion is. So it's a programmer's joke kind of to reuse a recursive acronym. So GNUs, not Unix. Of course, this leads you to the question, what does GNU stand for? And then you are back to the GNU abbreviation definition, and then you get into this infinite recursion loop, which is actually a bad recursion, because in a normal recursion that you program that does something, you would have a terminate statement at one point, but here you don't. It's a programmer's joke. So now you have this GNU license, which for a programmer's joke has this kind of weird abbreviation. Anyway, that's where this GNU or GNU comes from. Then you have this symbol. Then the other question that I ask myself, why don't I know much about this GNU project? Because if I think of free operating systems, I think of Linux. But Linux is only around since 1991, and there's some interesting history how GNU stuff or GNU stuff influenced Linux. My perception is, so at least from me growing then up in computer terms, maybe more, I don't know, quite late. So 2006, 2008, when I started working more with computers in my own work, because I wasn't a hacker when I was 18 or something. I think it's a little bit superseded by Linux, so people think more of Linux with the GNU project, at least from my generation. Anyway, it's something like Linux, which in the end then is maybe not that successful as Linux, but the license that came around, and because this was there before, Linux still stuck around. So that's the story. At the same time, when they developed this GNU project, where they wanted to have an operating system which is of free software, they at the same time started thinking about the licensing. And so they already in the 80s had early licenses that allowed or implemented the copyleft principle, so that people who would modify their work needed to license again under free software terms. And then there was a first version of the new general public license in the early 90s, and then actually for the longest time what was around was the new general public license version 2, which is also the license under which SPM is still distributed, also saying or later licenses, and the current license that you can choose at these open science databases like Zenodo, I would say Zenodo, but I think it's Zenodo, Figshare, Open Science Framework. They usually give you the option between version 3 and version 2. So the basic idea is that you grant software freedom and you keep things in a share-alike fashion. And then, as I also said earlier, there are things about the difference between source code, so human readable code and machine readable code in there. So it's all, the whole GPA text is basically has been developed by a community that is very keen on upholding free software, and this is basically what they fight for, and where they also have the legal expertise. So in 2006, 2007, a couple of things came around that were not really there in the early 90s. So for example, digital rights management and things like forbidding people to write software code that somehow circumvents digital right management. So at that time, actually the community and also Michael Stallman, who's then the author of this license in the end, thought about new things that had came up. in these 16 years between the early 90s and the mid 2000s. And now they put in some additional things which in this current license, the public license version 3, which might be more or less interesting actually from our perspective of open science. So I think a good thing is that what they put into the license is a little bit less of a reliance on copyright law terms that come from the US, specifically I think the one thing is this distribution versus conveying, because distribution was, this term distribute software was defined more in the US copyright law, or actually referred to as US copyright law, even if it wasn't really defined in there. So they tried to scale down on using a specific US copyright law so that the international applicability is higher, which is of course nice for us if we share things using these licenses. They aim for higher compatibility with other free software licenses because there's a zoo of these, right? So there is not only the GPL license, but if you just saw my slide in the beginning, or you just in OSF, you see that there's Apache license, there's this license, this license, this license, and they try to make things a little bit more compatible. Don't ask me about these other licenses. Like I said, that was a practical task that one can do and see what these other things do. What they also try to do is put in stronger protection against patent threats, and then things that I find interesting, but which, and I find amusing and find, oh, it's good that people do that, but I don't think it's really, from an open science perspective, the biggest problems. So, for example, that these licenses allow you in some way that I didn't really figure, but they somehow allow you to GPLing, so putting these free software licenses on code that circumvents digital restriction or rights management. They call it restriction management. I think it's other people call this digital right management, so that you can basically write code that hacks, for example, these things where you only have a license. So you can actually, under these licenses, so you can write code and then put a GPL license on that, and they made that legally. They find a loophole that it's legal, and also they find protection against terrorization, which means so that essentially what they're trying to circumvent is that people. So essentially, you have access to the source code, but because of restraints on the hardware side that vendors put in to how they ship computers, they can circumvent that. So the idea again being there's public domain software, and then vendors build up things so that software freedom downstream is suppressed. And to again avoid this, they put explicit terms into this GPL license that this is not allowed, so that a vendor who uses, so you write some free software, and then if somebody else wants to use this, they have to follow copyleft principles, so they have to use the same license and explicitly give downstream users all the rights and all the possibilities, all the instructions that they need to actually carry out modifications of the code and redistribute it. So there it goes really into kind of this, you have these people that are more on the digital rights, copyright enforcement, kind of the big Hollywood studios and production companies and so on. And then you have these people who try to keep up with putting into their licenses statements against them. So it's interesting. It's maybe not the first concern, but in terms of open science and reproducible code. But then at least one knows what's going on there. So what about these licenses? And so just to give you a feeling about the complexities of these things, if you don't have the feeling this is complex enough yet. So like I said, they are not necessarily all compatible, these licenses. So if you have some stuff under a certain license, for example, the CC BY share alike, license, and you now want to make some modification, you have to do a share alike, and you know that GPL is also a copyleft, hence the share alike licenses. What can you do? One thing that I found, and this is also what the Creative Commons people say about, of course, this GPL license, is that the CC BY share alike license is one-way compatible with GNU GPL v3. I think it's called GNU, but I somehow have you might know better people say GNU. I have
it's a wildebeest, that's probably why.
Yeah, sure. But I have it feels weird to say GNU GPL.
We used to say GNU.
Yeah.
I grew up with Unix.
And you grew up. Then it's definitely GNU. No, it's definitely GNU. But yeah. So what does? But I feel kind of weird because to me this is all new, and I didn't grow up on this anyway. So what does this one-way compatibility mean? That means you may license your contributions to adaptations of CC BY share alike for zero materials under GNU GPL v3, but not the other way around. So you may not license your contribution to GNU GPL v3 adaptation of GNU GPL under CC BY share alike 4.0. So that's this one-way compatibility. But so license compatibility, is an issue, and then you can look up more details. Listen, actually, an actual link. So this is actually all I had prepared. So why did I offer this workshop, and why did I think it's important? So as soon as you want to actually practically do open science, people ask you, give you the option to choose a license. And then you can say, oh, I'm going to choose this license. So I think it makes sense to know a little bit about what's going on so that you can make an informed choice. And I think it's fairly simple, the whole thing after all. So the big problem is that if you do scientific work, you have the copyright, unless your work contract says you don't have it, but that's fairly unlikely. So you have the copyright for your scientific and creative work. And the problem with copyright law is that it's fairly restricted. It actually hinders, if everybody would really try to avoid violating copyright law, and everybody wanted to be fully legally certain and doing things in the proper way, which I think in principle, of course, everybody wants, but then you know how things are. It's fairly restrictive, and you actually just by default, by doing scientific work, you actually restrict the use of these materials that you create quite a lot without you actually wanting that or maybe even knowing that. And then you can use CC licenses and GPL licenses for software to actually put in these allowances and manage your copyright in a way that you actually achieve what you want to achieve, namely that a lot of people use your work, and that maybe also this idea of reusability is upheld if you use a share alike. And yeah, the final thing is when you use software, and I think this is of course more and more the case, specifically in neuroimaging, and I know that some neuroimaging people are here, you should use free software licenses. So this is my take on the whole thing. But of course, so, and also in kind of my recommendations, but in the end, I mean, again, you have different things that you can choose for code, for example. Well, it says some of them are copyleft, some of them are only permissive, so they don't necessarily uphold the copyleft principle, but then there are others, so there is more to explore, and somehow one has to kind of, if one wants to practice open science, somehow know what one is doing there, unfortunately. So this is what I had to say. And then actually, I would primarily be interested, if you still have any energy left, in what you think. So, for example, you now hearing this. So, what will you do in your next open science framework project? What will you choose do you feel like you can make an informed choice now? What would you need to be able to make an informed choice? Or what did you do so far? I mean, did you have open science framework projects? So what did you choose and why was it easy? Because of course I also chose things and I also somehow tried to figure out what this is about, but then I was like, well, I cannot now spend like a day or two reading up on all these licenses. This is not what I want to do. I want to just essentially click something here and run it out. But so what's your opinion? Tell me something, you have to say something now. Do you feel a little bit more informed now, or do you feel completely confused, or what's going on?
I think you did very well in putting this all together. You should not put yourself down saying, oh, I just have it from a few brochures. It's very, very comprehensive, very, very good. But I'm not entirely sure what I think about the whole open sort of giving all your rights away, or a large part. I think this is probably, I feel like it boring at some point, but this is probably going to be a recurrent theme of the coming days. I think we have real issues in science with maybe not necessarily making a profit, but at least upholding our budget so that we actually can do science. It's very hard to get grants, and if by these means you have some way of retaining some rights to your work, to actually be able to have an extra infusion of money in your scientific enterprise, because after all, a lab is almost run as a business. And I'm not sure it's always the best for science to give it away.
So you would, for example, also as we discussed earlier, you would choose the non-commercial CC by non-commercial, or you would not put anything on Open Science Framework anyway? Or what's the...
Maybe not directly. I think if someone would ask me, oh, we know you're running this course in Oxford and we would be very keen to adopt it, can we negotiate? Then I would be very open to talk about it. And if it's a good project they want to use it for, why not? And I can give them the rights to use it by contract.
Can you dedicate one member from your group to report to the others what you did in this workshop in 3 sentences? Thank you.
However, I'm also afraid if I make it open to everyone, what are they going to do with it? Do I really have any? Am I going to be happy with everything they do with it? I mean, of course, if it's in the integrity of a code, they should be able to check my code. That's something I completely agree with. But if I design a really well thought through course and I just put it online, and someone's going to use it, and then not even, you can't check whether they mention you.
But then they would be violating copyright law. So if you use a CC5 license, so the attribution, yes, in principle you have the right then to go to court against them.
Of course, but I wouldn't know where it was used, or let's say
That's the same for anything. If you have all the copyrights, but you put it on the internet, you can also mention. How do you check? I mean,
no, but I have a feeling I can do something. Let's say, okay, so I'm in biology, right? So for me, it's maybe not that. I mean, if my science is good, is fine. But let's say you're in. Let's say you're in genetics, and you find some sort of an algorithm to really segregate populations. We know that race doesn't exist on a genetic level, but let's say we find some. And I just say, I make this open source, and now some sort of national socialist body decides, hey, actually this is open source. I can now just, I can just use it, I can modify it, I can do whatever, and I have absolutely no control over the internet. Whereas if I find this out and I do have a copyright license, say, not with my stuff. That's something I would be afraid.
Yeah, actually, I had a similar plan in terms of, or I came around a similar line of thinking in terms of open data. So, because we are dealing with neuroimaging data, which is, of course, sensitive data from a data protection viewpoint. And I used to be all all for just putting the data out there and making it completely open. But also with these kind of questions of who uses the data for what purpose, one actually starts to think whether one should be a little bit more responsible. So I have a solution in mind which actually frees the individual researcher from these questions, which we will talk about on Wednesday. But it is an issue, and I also completely agree. So a different thing in terms of open science was always this question: if you build something or write some code that is potentially, if you do some physics work and build a bomb, and this is kind of your science thing, so should that be open science? What's the point there? Or the other thing with code is, of course, with respect to military applications. So if you write some code that is very good in kind of machine learning code, and it's very good in figuring, doing things, do you want that? The argument against it, maybe or do you see arguments against these kind of fears? I have one argument that maybe is.
That's because the argument of the bomb is a little bit an argument of sharing your data.
I know, but these are also the arguments. I mean, even if this is also why I came around this kind of thinking, because there are people who are all pro open science, pro reproducible and transparency. And I think most of them, I guess everyone in between is essentially on that side. There are also people that are not on that side. They use arguments like, for example, data protection to say, yeah, we cannot share fMRI data because of data protection. And then the question is, how do you deal with these kind of arguments? Just within the scientific system where you might feel that things should be more open, more reproducible, I think one has to also take kind of these, think about these arguments to, again, then find a way to argue, okay, yes, I appreciate that, but what about, and then we need a further argument.
You can blind the IDs, I suppose, ID of the subjects.
Yeah, but you can still tell from the T1 how the person looks like. But there are algorithms that can cut out the face, right?
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know how good they are, to be honest.
I think this is actually a different debate, but of course I brought it on myself. So that's kind of the data protection law. I don't think that this whole data protection applies if data is pseudonymized, not if it's anonymized. From my perspective, you cannot tell people anymore that you anonymize their data, because then, or you can say that, but then you can have the other non-open science people that will say, yeah, but machine learning, they are the progress in machine learning. Soon everyone will be identifiable, and think about if they connect. This is also not what non-open science people say. Also, data protection officers actually make these kind of arguments. And then you have to argue again from a transparent, reproducible background of how you still can make open science a reality, even if you or reproducible transparent research, even if you respect data protection, and in this case respect copyright. I think this is actually where one needs to argue. No?
But you can ask the patient in the written informed consent if you must direct.
Yeah, that wouldn't go through ethics.
This is the problem.
They don't do that. They don't allow you to do that. We had the same issue. They were like, no, there's no way for you to anonymize your data. You can just pseudonymize
No, and
your
then the
data.
other way around, you can ask the patient that if it's okay for the patient for their data to be openly shared under pseudonymized IDs, then I don't see really the problem.
Yeah.
Because you can
The
put
ethics
in
wouldn't have to see the
an
first
article, you can put the face of a person with not even black eyes, so this is even more direct than having new imaging data. You have the face.
Of course, but the ethics committee won't let it pass. Like, you won't be able to conduct that study.
And what's their argument? The main argument?
To protect the participants from any kind of harm, that other people can go about and take their data and their information and use it for whatever.
I mean,
or anything.
isn't the best counter argument just give them one of the patient's spreadsheets and say, all right, identify this
Oh,
person for me. Show me them.
And they
I mean,
don't
if
bother
you
to
don't-
do that.
Yeah.
But so
Yeah.
definitely, and this is also, I mean, this is the data protection discussion, but also with ethics committees, of course, that's also my experience actually, also data protection officers, and there I think it's also in the long run, if we really want to make transparent, reproducible, and open research a reality, these are the things that one needs to think about, and then later if one continues in science or academia and then maybe gets into ethics boards oneself, kind of now take into account and then be prepared for, and maybe then be able to have better ethics or IRBs which are a little more informed and which see other ways, because right now there's a lot of, from my perspective, there's a lot of legal uncertainties around open science. And this leads to people shutting down and saying, we cannot do it. But to work into that direction, I think information is quite important. But
I think this new law on data protection that recently came out, it only made it worse. Because the ethics committee, they went crazy. They didn't know what to look for, but they knew that they need to be strict.
Yeah, so we are writing, so on Wednesday I will talk about this, we are writing with Eleanor, we are almost done writing this paper on, especially for the neuroimaging case, because there are some papers about the GDPR and medical data, but it definitely made things worse in terms of creating still and making people maybe a little bit more aware of it. But maybe let's come back to, for a second, to Creative Commons licenses and so on. So can you tell me which kind of license, I'm really interested, so what kind of license will you choose on your next, so if you, not software, but will you use, not only you, I will go everyone, but sorry, it's not all about you. Maybe this is, because we talk now on this. So, what kind of license will you use? Will you share non-commercial, only buy? Will you not?
For what kind of documents?
Let's say for the figures that you made for your next project and that you put onto it.
Right. I think well then I would further think about if there are any sensible data included, or if there are ways you can use these data in a way that I don't want to, but
let's say
especially
it's really just creative work. So let's not over too common. So you just made a nice figure that visualizes some abstract thing.
yeah. Well, then I think I would use the copyright where I forgot the real name, but what I meant, what I mean is that you would have to say my name, but that's the only thing. Like, you can change it and you can publish it or like use it and stuff. So I would say this was on this hierarchy pretty far up, right?
So that which also would include the case that people might change a little bit on this, which qualifies for an independent work, but then remove it. So if they have done something that's a little bit better than your stuff, would put it under licenses which are not free, so that people cannot modify that new great stuff. That's
But no, say again, I didn't get the last part.
yeah, that's
They
it.
change it so it's a little bit better, and then they put a new copyright on it.
Yeah.
So that then I can't do, or like, So that would be the danger.
Yeah, I am actually not quite sure whether this is actually a danger, but this is what the free software people say, because your original work that was not under share like is still there, right? So it's still there and people can freely use it. But this new thing that is a little bit better than your stuff, that might not be free anymore. But I'm not sure whether this is actually a problem, whether I believe this will be in all of the public domain, because well, the original is still there, but maybe
I don't think this would be worse than not publishing it at all. Like if I wouldn't have access to it at all.
And would you be happy for someone to take your code or whatever you take and commercialize it without you getting any of the benefits?
Well, when I think doing this would spread the idea that I had and it was a good idea, then I would say I think.
But it's not your idea anymore because they can do now with it whatever they
No,
want.
it's CC BY, so it's his
Oh,
idea,
I
and
see.
it needs attribution. So it would always say, I don't know, Johannes Schnieterings, great idea and great code, which you can pay us 5,000 euros, but Johannes isn't going to get that. But it was Johannes' idea.
Well, is that really an issue? Because like in neuroimaging, I mean, we use SPM because it's freeware. There are tons of other programs that do the exact same thing and they're not freeware. People don't use it. Isn't that the same case?
Don't use it?
Don't use it.
Well, there are some people who use Brain Voyager.
Yeah, I mean, they use Brain Voyager because they work in Frankfurt. They get it for free from Rainer Goebel. Okay, it's the same in Maastricht. I understand it, but yeah, I mean, yeah. So his program would still be used, right, by most people. So I think that
sure.
wouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but for example, I think Brain Voyager is a good example, although it's a fairly small community. But what Brain Voyager, of course, did is make a really nice interface. So it makes, or GUI, let's say, not interface, but a graphical user interface, so that it opens kind of doing new imaging for a community that is maybe not that programming defined and so on. So, and then there is commercial potential, so yeah, it could still be used, but some part of the cake is then of the potential usership is of course using something commercial, which is fine, but yeah, it's just then the issue whether you feel happy with that somebody else is making money that you could have made.
I guess that would be okay.
Yeah, and if it's really a lot of money. And your grant is rejected, and then.
Yeah. Well, I would be angry then, but if I couldn't have foreseen, or let's say I would take the risk now. If I would say, okay, maybe chances are pretty low that this would happen, and if this happens, then okay, then I will be a little angry. But from my perspective right now, when I think about how to publish it right now, it's the thing I would take the risk.
The other thing is, of course, that if it was awesome and you, of course, with CC BY, your name would be associated with it, then also everybody in science or academia would know that you had this great idea and you were doing science as well. So,
I don't know, it might be that if a lot of money is involved, that will change the law. I mean, it's a little bit the same with patent, where there is money involved and then you don't have the rights. If you have a great idea for whatever software, whatever thing, the Charité owns it. It's in your contract.
exactly. That's
So
another
this is something
thing.
different, and I think that if you make such a beautiful picture, I figure that people will pay tons of dollars to put it on their webpage, then they will thinking about changing your contract. I mean, it wouldn't apply for this, but and that's some discussion of open Creative Commons anymore. I think
Yeah, but they cannot. What they cannot do.
they could not do it retrospectives, but they would change it. But so, I think it's a little bit of a weird discussion because it's it's comparing two different things in a way. I mean, often you have in this field you have not so much money involved. That's why you have more freedom to share it, and that's why this non-commercial thing is not really. I mean, I wouldn't mind so much if someone earns money by doing a tutorial where he earns money with my material. So, yeah, nice. I don't care. Seriously, because it's a little money.
I would also be more concerned if this is, if the purpose, like if they use the data for a purpose that I wouldn't support. This is then something I think I would be more concerned about than someone else money.
But one has to be a little bit specific here about data versus creative rights, because So this is what I had primarily in mind. Not I, but the Creative Commons people. They are primarily interested in these creative works. With data, there was it's still a little bit of a so pure data that you acquire somewhere. This is still fairly gray area. So definitely you cannot copyright data per se. But you can copyright things like databases if you arrange them, and there's a Schöpfungshöhe and so on. But the data per se then doesn't really fall under the whole copyright thing. So I think this is also maybe something that I learned from this. So it's mainly about the text that I write, the nice images that I produce, and the code that I write. And with the data, it's getting wow, because then you have.
Can you copyright the analysis figures? Because that's your interpretation of the
Yeah.
reality, right?
Yeah. So this is also what I think in terms of artwork always. So that if you, because then you also decide. So there's your personality is expressed, for example, in that you choose no colors. So you choose black and white because that's what you like, and that's your personality. Or you make it very fancy.
Or base statistics.
Or base
Or
statistics,
that.
because that's your personality.
But can I ask a question?
Sure.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, that at the University of Zurich, they have the impression that they own the code that I write while I work for them.
They are right.
Yes. So how can I issue a license for my code if it's actually the university's code?
That's a good question. You might actually not be able to. What do I know? I mean, if they have the copyright and they have the full Urheberrecht for all of the Urheberrechte that exist under Switzerland, Swiss Urheberrecht, so not only the right for exploitation that you sign over to them, but everything, then I guess they would have to...
They won't care, but when this case turns out that someone else uses then my code to commercialize and make a lot of money, then they will care.
Essentially, they should have if they have this, from my perspective, the university should, if they have this in these contracts, they should explicitly tell you what kind of license you should apply when you share your code, so that it's essentially that they are the people who give the license. And this is also something that I find, these questions are somewhat pressing in the sense that we can all click these licenses and want to share code, but the institutions are not really into this. So at Freie Universität Berlin, we didn't even have, so you know that there was this big GDPR fuss in May when you're on all websites, you saw these new things that you had to click and so on, and everybody was going a little bit crazy. FU wasn't going crazy. They somehow figured that it's not that there will be no fines for governmental institutions like universities. So they knew that these big fines that might apply, they don't apply to them. They knew that, and then they said, well, okay, then whatever. And there was never ever a discussion about what is the idea in terms of again in data protection. In terms of data protection, is how do we want to do ethical, legally fine research, which is we don't have any time, money, and us to go deep into that. I think that's also something changing a little bit now because we have a new CEO and so on. But it's kind of the same situation. One has to push, kind of the institutions to kind of get their head around these things as well.
Then you have also to be aware that when you change your institution, do you take your code with you or not?
Yes, because also when you change the institution, you don't take your data with you. It belongs to your PI. They say, and if they say so, then I think it's a hassle.
It's a difficult terrain, I would say. So commercializing your ideas, you have to be very careful what you do.
You can probably, your best bet, if you ever gave it to a friend and it somehow got commercialized and you didn't foresee it, your best bet is probably say, oh, sorry, my computer was hacked. No control over it. No, really sorry.
No, then did you protect it?
I have the university antivirus software and everything. So I have a password. What do you want me to do? Put it in a safe? Yeah.
Okay, maybe it's time for you. I know the others are not there. You have to do project work right now, right? So it's not that there's a meeting and everybody's having fun over there and still sit here. Yeah, from my perspective, it's okay if we call it a day. If you don't have any pressing questions, I'll be around if you come up with other questions. But I will not be around today later. So I think the idea is that you now think a little bit about your projects.
So what are the 3 sentences we say afterwards?
Yeah, this is what you have to come up with. So I have this. I can just bias you. So you can say something like this. Maybe look at the slides to inspire you. So whatever. You have to come up with that. So. So I mean, for me, it's really about these websites where you choose these licenses, and maybe you know what you're doing, maybe you don't know what you're doing. I don't know.
I have just one question. I mean, on the show, you could do research. Is there any need for doing anything else than CC BY? I mean, the important question is about the data. I mean, when you share the data of the patients or of whatever that's something different, but I mean, the code that you use to analyze the data that you later on publish in a paper, which you, if you follow this idea, want to share so someone else sees that you did your homework, and I mean, who cares about? I mean, what's the use of using anything else than CC BY? I don't see really the point.
I also don't see it, but I agree. But then again, if you share your code with a lot of other code that demands share alike or copy left,
there might be something different for the neuroimaging field, maybe. But I mean, in general, if you just analyze data.
Yeah, but so meaning you analyze data, for example, in Python. I don't know how these Python packages, how they are licensed. I would have the feeling because they also come from the free software kind of thing, that they also do want to uphold this copy left thing. Even I'm not convinced about this copy left thing, as I told you. So I would agree. I would say CC BY is fine. But on the other hand, that would only apply to code that I'm sharing. That I wouldn't share. This is the thing: code never by CC BY, but because code doesn't fall under Creative Commons licenses. So code would mean the free software licenses, but even in the free software licenses, there are licenses that are more like CC BY than like share alike. So they are the non-copyleft licenses. So there you could then choose not GPL, but a more permissive license, which one would have to look a little bit into the details. But then again, yeah, it comes with if you try to really make things reproducible, it's not only the one program that you wrote, but it's the whole environment. And then
it would be possible to write something like I don't care about my properties, so just follow the rules, follow the leaders, follow every license that was there before. I mean, yeah, just in general, I feel really bored if I would apply the code for just simple statistics, then read into every software license agreement to find out what I have to do. I mean, this is also quite annoying.
It is.
If your statistics are so simple, then it might not even be worth to publish the code. If you just
in a way, no. Depends. I mean, at least I know. I do my statistics in R. We don't want to read the license agreement of our to see, and also not of every package that is.
Yeah. So, but there it's clear that it inherits the most. To use R and packages of R, it will inherit the most restrictive license that has been applied there.
Yeah, but the question is, do you have to name it when you publish it? I mean, in general, you have.
In general, you have.
because otherwise someone has to read my code and say, well, there's no license in it, so I can do whatever. So I have to read.
You have to be thankful enough
5
to our
packages
community
and
that
a license agreement to just qualify for what I.
Yes,
kind of ridiculous.
But actually, that's a good
Yeah,
point.
but I'm actually not. I don't think it's necessarily that ridiculous. I mean, it's kind of making it's information that should be made available to you maybe a little bit more formally and maybe a little bit simpler than today. So it's something that you shouldn't have to worry about a lot. I agree. But I don't think one gets away without worrying about it. Of course, one gets away without worrying about it by just not caring and just doing something. But then, of course, open science exists a little bit in a non-legal and somewhat uncertain framework. And then the question is, why not set up open science and reproducible research in a legally fine manner? And then I would say, okay, there's some people which should take care of it. Of course, it's not, I don't want to do it, and you don't want to do it. But then, if you, for example, join a lab or start a PhD, that's clearly communicated to you in a very simple tutorial. So we use, for everything that we do that online, we make it to make it reproducible, and this is the license that we choose for this and this reason, so you don't have to worry about it, but you know what you're doing. So this is, I think, one can of course say, like I also did for data protection issues and for whatever, nothing will happen. And I guess in the long run, nothing will happen really. But then you always have these anti-open science people who can say, wow, this is only legal. And then, anyway.
Do you have a technology transfer office here in Berlin?
Yes, I guess there are things that are called that, and we also have kind of a Center for Digital Systems at FU or something. But the thing is, because this is all new and the open science movement is kind of newish, I mean, it's 10 years or so, they are not really prepared for these kind of questions.
Right.
That's more my experience.
Because I think if you, in Oxford, you have the Oxford University Innovations, and they are they deal with all the licensing, they deal with the MTAs from the university, but also with spin-outs, so they set up.
Yeah, I mean, this is what's also existing in terms of patents. This is, I think, much better taken care of, because that's obviously where more money is. I think, I don't know whether you've seen it, but I think in terms of open science, I think Cambridge has a really nice infrastructure now, this Apollo project, so they seem to have put a lot of effort in also clarifying these kind of nitty-gritty details. I guess, so it just, when I searched around a little bit for kind of gold standards or really nice examples for these discussions at Freie Universität, what can be done. I thought Cambridge really, they went quite far on the open science aspects.
One quick question: the EU, there is a EU Urheberrechts
Revision.
right now.
Yeah.
I've heard it. Are there any impacts?
What does it mean?
Well, there is a big one, and it's about mostly, or the most protests against it, because there are maybe there's some upload filters coming. So there are some.
This is what I know as well.
Sorry?
This is what I know.
Yeah. So there is lots of attention on it, and I think they discussed it a couple of weeks back or month back. Then it was rejected, and now a few days ago, I think it was in the EU Parliament again. And I think now it was some parts were accepted. So there is this discussion going on right now.
So what do they want to do?
Well, I think they want to protect this copyright thing. Like I think the idea is, for example, big Verlage, a publisher, but they don't can't really. They have these copyright rights, but in the internet, they won't be protected, or there are many violations. So now they're trying to figure out how can they get their rights from this publisher on the internet established, right? And then they are always afraid that they have to introduce upload filters where, on Twitter or Facebook, when you upload things, then this filter will check if you have cited, a newspaper without saying that it's from this newspaper or something, then it will block it. And so then they were putting out.
Oh, that new, yeah. There was also a big thing I saw on 9gag with the meme community that wouldn't be possible anymore because this stuff is plucked from films and such.
But I was only wondering if there is an impact on this research.
Might be, I mean, but
I haven't heard it.
It's fairly detailed. And there are a few people actually who also in Germany who work on this interface between legal questions of open science and are really lawyers and so on. So there are a few projects in Germany happen there, but not that many. Well, good. Then to your project work.
Okay.